5:30, nearly 50 years after the murder of a Harvard grad student, there are finally some answers.
Using DNA evidence, investigators say they now know who killed Jane Britton in 1969. As WBZ's Lisa Greshy shows us, the man has been linked to two other murders in the Boston area.
In 1969, Harvard graduate student Jane Britton was found murdered in her own bed. For over 50 years, questions mounted.
A locked door would not have saved her, neither would a scream, because nobody heard one that night. What actually protected her killer wasn't cunning, and it wasn't luck. It was time. 49 years of it, nearly half a century where the truth sat sealed in an evidence locker, while an entire community pointed its finger at exactly the wrong door. A Harvard graduate student. A fine red powder scattered across a crime scene that sent investigators chasing a ghost for 5 decades. A professor who spent 40 years as the prime suspect in the court of public opinion without ever being charged. And one man's brother submitting his own DNA to a genealogy website for a completely unrelated reason, who had no idea he was about to hand police the answer everyone had been searching for since 1969. Stick around, because the person responsible for this murder was never once on anyone's suspect list, not even close. This is the case that took 2 generations, a scientific breakthrough nobody could have predicted in 1969, and one dead man's blood to finally close. Before we go any further, if unsolved cases that get quietly buried by the wrong theory are exactly why you're on this channel, hit that subscribe button right now, because this one has more twists than almost any case we've covered. Now, let's go back to the beginning, to the last ordinary night of Jane Britton's life. Cambridge, Massachusetts, January of 1969. Winter had settled hard over Harvard Square, and 2 blocks off it, in a 4th-floor walk-up on University Road, a 23-year-old woman named Jane Britton was preparing for the most important day of her academic life. Jane wasn't coasting on a family name. She had earned every inch of her place at Harvard. Her father was an administrative vice president at Radcliffe College. Her mother was a visiting scholar in medieval history. But Jane built her own path entirely, graduating magna cum laude from Radcliffe in 1967, then walking straight into Harvard's brutal doctoral program in Near Eastern archaeology, a program designed to filter out everyone except the most stubborn. She read several languages. She painted. Colleagues at Harvard's Peabody Museum remembered her sharp, dry sense of humor decades later. The kind of person who disappeared without explanation and reappeared like nothing happened, joking that the rumors of her death had been greatly exaggerated. She had also quietly survived something most of her friends never knew about. As an undergraduate, a man had attacked her on Cambridge Common. She fought him off with a pocket knife and told no one. That was who Jane was, someone who handled things herself. The previous summer, she had spent months in southeastern Iran on an archaeological dig led by her academic advisor, a charismatic and imposing professor whose students had a private nickname for him that had nothing to do with affection. It was on that dig that Jane grew close to her boyfriend, a fellow anthropology student. January 6, 1969, the first Monday back after winter break, was the eve of Jane's general exams. Pass or fail. Everything she had worked toward for years came down to the next morning. That night was almost aggressively normal. Dinner with classmates at a restaurant near campus. Ice skating with her boyfriend on Cambridge Common, the very same common where, years earlier, she had fought off a stranger and never told a soul. They returned to her building around 10:30 at night. He stayed about an hour while she talked through her nerves about the exam, then left around 11:30. By every account, it was an ordinary good night between 2 people who fully expected to see each other the next morning. A few minutes later, Jane knocked on her neighbor's door for a nightcap. A young couple, fellow anthropology students, close enough to her that she had played the organ at their wedding. They shared a drink, nothing remarkable. At 12:30 in the morning, Jane said goodnight and walked back to her own apartment. No one saw her alive again. The next morning, Harvard's anthropology doctoral candidates filed into the Peabody Museum for their general exams. Jane wasn't among them. That alone was strange. Not for her, and not on this day of all days. Her boyfriend called her apartment from inside the exam hall. No answer. He sat through his own exam with a low, specific dread building in the back of his mind. The kind of feeling that's easy to dismiss right up until it isn't. When the exam ended, he went straight to her building. He knocked. Nothing. He got her neighbor from next door, and the two men went in together. At first, almost nothing looked disturbed. Money sat untouched on the dresser. Her jewelry hadn't been taken. Her cat wandered the apartment completely unbothered. Books lay open, art supplies were scattered across the table, the ordinary clutter of someone in the middle of an ordinary life. Then they reached the bed. A sheepskin rug and a fur coat had been pulled up and over it. Her neighbor lifted the cover. Jane Britton had been struck multiple times with a sharp or pointed object. One blow had fractured her skull, and she had been sexually assaulted. The blood was confined almost entirely to the bed, which told the medical examiner something specific and horrifying. Whatever happened, happened fast, to someone who never had a chance to reach the door. The murder weapon was never found. Jane's mother arrived that afternoon and stood over her daughter's body. She said only one thing, that Jane was a good girl, and she could not understand why something like this had happened to her. It's a sentence that says nothing, and somehow holds everything. Nobody in that room had an answer for her. For the next 50 years, almost nobody would. Here is where the case takes the turn that would define the next 5 decades. And it starts with a fine, reddish powder. Scattered across Jane's apartment, the walls, the floor, even the ceiling, and across her own body, investigators found a red pigment. Lab analysis identified it as red ochre, a substance used in burial rituals by ancient civilizations across the world, including sites in the Near East. For a community of archaeologists, that detail didn't feel like a coincidence. Jane had just spent a summer excavating an ancient site in Iran. Investigators theorized that whoever killed her had performed something like a ritual over her body. A university source floated the idea publicly. Newspapers ran with it within days, and once a story like that gets loose, it cannot be called back. Cambridge's police chief eventually tried to shut the theory down with a public statement calling it inaccurate. It didn't matter. The narrative had already chosen its suspects, and every single one of them came from inside Jane's own world. Her boyfriend, the last person outside the building to see her alive, had a solid alibi that held up completely. It didn't stop the whispers, and he withdrew from Harvard's graduate program not long after. Her neighbor, the man who had shared that last drink with her and found her body the next day, would spend the better part of 50 years believing, like almost everyone around him, that the killer had to be someone inside the department. Other archaeology students and faculty were pulled into suspicion, with no hard evidence connecting them to anything. One of them died decades later, having never shaken the cloud that followed him his entire career. And then there was her own academic advisor, the professor who had led the dig in Iran, a man some students said had taken more than a professional interest in Jane's work. Within days of the murder, Harvard's dean personally called to offer him legal counsel before he had even asked for it. He would go on to run the very museum where Jane had studied for years, while rumors trailed him through every hallway beneath him. About a month after the murder, a grand jury convened. It ran for more than 6 months. Harvard anthropology students and faculty were called in one after another, stripped of any presumption of innocence in the public eye. And then, nothing. No indictment. The grand jury dissolved without charging a single person, and the same newspapers that had covered the case so aggressively in January barely mentioned that it had ended in silence. The case didn't close, it simply stopped making noise. If you're still with me at this point, drop a comment below with where you're watching from. Let's see who is truly locked into this one. We read every single comment. Because what happens next is going to completely flip everything you think you know about who was responsible for this. Piece by piece, the theory that had consumed the entire investigation began to collapse. An archaeological tool reported missing from Jane's apartment turned up exactly where it had always been, misplaced in the chaos of the crime scene, never stolen at all. And the red ochre itself had a far less dramatic explanation waiting the entire time. Jane was a painter. Ochre is a standard pigment in oil-based paint. The jar had been sitting among her art supplies the whole time, scattered during the struggle on her bed. The most compelling theory in the case, the one that had directed suspicion at an entire academic department for decades, turned out to be completely wrong. And for 50 years, it was the only story anyone had. What almost nobody understood in 1969 was that the real evidence in this case wasn't a rumor, a red powder, or a professor's reputation. It was a biological sample recovered during the original investigation, sealed and preserved, waiting for a science that hadn't been invented yet. DNA profiling did not exist in 1969. It would not exist for nearly 2 more decades. For years, the case moved through Harvard's anthropology department the way certain kinds of trauma move, passed forward, not left behind. Female graduate students reportedly kept an informal file on the case, handed down from one incoming class to the next. Not because anyone wanted it, because it had quietly become theirs to carry. Then, in 2009, a Harvard undergraduate heard a whispered version of the story, a rumor about a professor, a cover-up, a case the university supposedly wanted buried. It stuck with her. She spent the next decade chasing it, interviewing survivors of the case, sitting in on lectures, fighting for the release of public records. That pressure, combined with formal requests filed with the district attorney's office in 2017, triggered something that hadn't happened in decades, a fresh set of eyes on Jane's sealed evidence. And this time, someone in that review asked a question the original investigators never had the tools to ask. In October of 2017, the State Police Crime Lab ran the 1969 biological sample through a technique built specifically to extract a male-specific DNA profile from decades-old, degraded material. Standard testing on this sample had already failed once before. This was the last resort. It worked. For the first time in 48 years, a usable male DNA profile emerged from the evidence collected the night Jane died. That profile went into a national database of convicted offenders. In July of 2018, it came back with what investigators call a soft hit, a partial match strong enough to name a candidate, but not yet strong enough to confirm one. The name that came back was not a name anyone in Jane's world had ever spoken. He was already dead. He had died of cancer in 2001, at the age of 54. Just over a year after being paroled from a 15 to 20-year sentence for a 1975 rape. And he was already by that point linked through DNA to 2 other unsolved killings in the Boston area. A 23-year-old woman murdered in her apartment in 1972, and a 24-year-old woman murdered in her apartment in 1973. Both women alone at home. Both entered without warning. To turn a soft hit into a confirmed match, investigators needed DNA from a close male relative. His file listed a brother, but by the 2010s, nobody knew where he was. Investigators found him the same way millions of ordinary people build their family trees today, through a genealogy website. He agreed to give a sample. When his DNA was tested against the profile recovered from Jane's apartment, it excluded 99.92% of the male population as a possible source. This man's DNA had been sitting on that evidence since the early hours of January 7, 1969, and here is the detail that undoes 50 years of theory in a single breath. He had no connection whatsoever to Jane's world, not her department, not her friends, not archaeology, not Iran, not Harvard. What he did have was a childhood tie to Cambridge. He had attended first grade there, had a juvenile record with local police, and had worked less than a mile from Jane's building only 2 years before the murder. He knew the neighborhood. He knew exactly which old buildings still had fire escapes running past unlocked windows. He climbed in through one of them. He never learned Jane's name. On November 20th, 2018, 6 weeks shy of the murder's 50th anniversary, the district attorney stood in front of reporters and said the sentence Jane's family had waited half a century to hear, that after nearly 50 years, the mystery of who killed Jane Britton had finally been solved, and the case was officially closed. It remains the oldest cold case that Office has ever cracked. A reporter asked the obvious question: what about the red ochre, the ritual theory that had haunted the case for decades? The answer was one sentence. It was a red herring, completely unrelated to the crime. Jane's own paint scattered in the struggle. The story that had defined 50 years of suspicion turned out to explain nothing at all. The DNA match didn't just name a killer. It formally cleared every single person who had spent decades living under a cloud of suspicion they never earned. Her neighbor, the man who had shared that last drink with her and found her body the next day, later said plainly that almost nobody at the time believed a stranger could have done this. Everyone assumed it was someone from inside the department. He had believed it too, for 50 years. Her own advisor, the case's unofficial prime suspect for 4 decades, was cleared as well. The worst thing anyone could say about him now was that he had been the convenient shape of a story that needed a villain, and the story had been wrong from the very start. Most of Jane's immediate family did not live long enough to hear any of this. Her parents were gone long before 2018, but her brother, a vicar at a church in California, was alive to receive the answer. He thanked the investigators, journalists and officers who had kept the case alive across 5 decades. He said that half a century of speculation had clouded the crime that shattered his sister's life and his family's, and that the DNA evidence might be all the conclusion they would ever get, that learning to understand and forgive remained the harder part. The man responsible is believed to have raped at least 5 women and killed at least 3 of them across the late 1960s and early 1970s. Women who, investigators say, never knew him and never saw him coming. He did not choose Jane Britton. He chose a building with an unsecured fire escape. She simply happened to be the one inside it. For half a century, everyone who loved Jane looked inward, at her department, her colleagues, her advisor, the small, insular world she belonged to. It was the only story the evidence ever seemed to support, and it was completely wrong. The danger had never been inside her world. It came from outside it, through a window on a fire escape that her own building had been cited for failing to secure, while the institution responsible treated the story less like a tragedy and more like a problem to manage until it quietly went away. It took one journalist's decade-long obsession, a records request, a lab technique that didn't exist in 1969, and a stranger's DNA sample submitted to a genealogy website for a completely unrelated reason, to finally close the door 50 years later. Secure the fire escape nobody thinks to check. Know your exits. Report the thing that feels wrong before it has to become evidence in a case that takes 50 years to close. Some stories don't stay buried. This one just took longer than most. If this case stayed with you, drop a comment right now with the 2 words that sum up how it ends: wrong door. And let's see how many of you saw that coming. Then hit subscribe, because True Crime Archives brings you a case like this every single week, and the one we're covering next has an ending almost nobody has heard the real version of. If you want more stories like this one, hit like before you go. I'll see you in the next case.